Chapter 2, Great Expotations Reprise. Varian and I became closer over the next couple of weeks. I became interested in his hobbies, and we became lab partners of sorts. Quirin welcomed me with open arms, and I felt like I had the family I never got. Though I did miss an important experiment that sent old Corona into chaos. Apparently, Varian tried to create hot running water, and it didn't work out too well. He also met the princess. The one day I'm out in the woods away from Varian, all the cool stuff happens. As soon as I returned, he tried to catch me up. As he told me excitedly about the princess's hair, he paused. And it was unreal. He looked at me. He seemed to be both in deep thought and shock. What do you mean? I lifted my goggles so I could read his face better. Her hair was, now you know I don't use this word lightly, but magical. He bit his lip as I looked in shock. Varian hardly believed magic was real, no less used the word to describe something he had studied so closely. I couldn't think of anything that could cause it to glow. Healing powers, while lost, are unexplainable. And I've been up the past 2 nights thinking about it. It's just beyond me. Beyond alchemy. Beyond science itself. I blinked for a moment. Varian had never been so lost to explain something. Usually he jumped to any length to push away the idea of magic, but he seemed so stumped. Forget it. We have an entry for an expo to finish. Varian gave me a smile, looking at the art he had doodled of the black rocks. I'll give him this. The drawing was very realistic. But I'm horrible at drawing, so what do I know? What should we name the element? I asked him. Well, I have a small idea. Cassandra? He blushed and I laughed. You're such a dork. You really have a crush on the princess's lady-in-waiting? I laughed. She's like 20. I tightened the screws of our project as he rolled his eyes. So? He smiled, wiping the inside of the machine, being careful not to activate it. I rolled my eyes, putting my goggles back over them. Whatever. If you need help, I'm your wingman. Wingwoodman? I shrugged, he laughed, and I continued to speak. We are going to rock this expo. He gave his usual wide, goofy smile, ash covering his freckles. Yeah! A Viper Pipebrian? Let's not mix our names. It makes us sound like we're dating. I laughed. I had never been in a relationship before, but I knew, if anything, Varian would not be my first. His smile grew wider. Viper! I smiled. Never mind. I love it. We shared a laugh as the day crept into night. Quirin came down into the lab as the sun set. Time for me to go? I smiled at Quirin, who had become a father figure to me. I wiped the soot off my face. No, you may stay the night. With the rocks, I fear you may be hurt going out late, he said, taking an anxious look out the window. Suddenly, one of Varian's traps went off. A raccoon had been trapped at the door. I ran over, recognizing the ring-tailed creature as the same one who had been trying to get into the lab for weeks. Hello, Rediger, I smiled. Varian had given him a name that just rolls off the tongue. I let Rediger out of the trap and set him on the desk. Stay. Varian looked at me with anger. Toss him out. He looked at the raccoon. What's the point? We already named him, and he's just going to keep coming back. I picked our reddest apple from the sack we kept in the lab for snacking on, handing it to the trash panda. Who's our nasty lab hand? I scratched the raccoon's ear. Varian laughed, looking at the raccoon with sympathy. I guess he is cute. Quirin nodded. You kids need to get ready for bed. He looked at Varian sternly. Varian quickly retorted with, I don't think we will. We're almost done with the machine. He smiled as we both put our goggles back on. But you need to be well rested for the expo tomorrow. Quirin started tidying up our things, looking at our experiments curiously. What does your machine do anyway? Varian stood up. He didn't know what Quirin would think. It, creates Cassandrium? What is that? Quirin looked at Varian curiously. Varian rubbed his neck. A new element. Quirin nodded as he put a beaker down. Interesting. Go to bed soon. He walked to the lab, and we both let out a sigh of relief. Varian tightened the screws of our machine, smiling at what we've created. Should we test it? I looked at it closely. In the morning, I'm exhausted, he yawned, stretching. He then looked up at the blankets and tarps we had piled up in the corner of the room, going to them and laying out a couple. Come here, Rediger. Time to sleep. The raccoon ran over, laying on its new bed. I set my goggles on Varian's desk and untied my apron. My green dress was covered in dirt, and I couldn't help but laugh at how my apron had failed. We both came out of the lab and smiled at Quirin as we passed through the kitchen. Hey, can I make you guys something? You guys have been a real big help, and I would love to make you my very own sugar cookie recipe. I smiled. Baking has always been a comfort of mine, so sharing it with the people who have been taking care of me seemed like an amazing idea. Quirin gave a hesitant look at Varian, who smiled. Of course! Can I help you make them? Varian approached the cupboards, preparing to help me gather ingredients. I nodded, and we spent the rest of the night baking cookies. Varian and I woke up early the next morning to test our machine. Everything seemed to work fine. We discussed safety precautions we'd have to be extra sure of while presenting, and we were on our way to the expo. As we arrived, we spotted Cassandra fixing the banner for the expo. I looked at Varian. Is that your girlfriend? I smirked. He sputtered, flustered, and spat out, She's not my girlfriend. A guard walked by us, and Cassandra looked at him enviously. Hey, this is your chance, I nudged Varian's arm. You're right, who's ready for the expo? He waved to Cass, who rolled her eyes. My heart immediately hurt for Varian. Hey, Cassie, you want to see our new invention? Rumor has it is a shoo-in for first prize in the contest. I quickly followed it with a, he started the rumor. She sighed. Oh, hey. First off, it's Cass, not Cassie. Second off, I don't believe we've met. She extended her hand to me. Cassandra. I'm Piper. I shook her hand. She then looked back to Varian. Third off, I'm slammed, so Varian laughed, interrupting her. Oh yeah, I hear ya. Hey, so did I tell you our invention can create an entirely new element? We call it... Before Varian could embarrass himself more, Sam stepped around the corner and told Cass her dad might need her on standby, so she quickly went off. Ugh, tough break, Vari. I chuckled, nudging his arm. He looked down disappointedly. He then looked up at the now falling banner and quickly went up the ladder. I looked behind myself to see the princess herself running up. Rapunzel had strange-looking goggles on her face. She looked at Varian and shouted, Hey, Cass, looking good! Check out these crazy goggles. Her goggles must have just focused, since she followed it with, Oh, Varian, I haven't seen you since... Eugene quickly snapped. Since your last machine almost killed us, he frowned, which confused me a little. From what I understood, Eugene and Varian had got on pretty well, but maybe Varian embellished that part a little bit. Varian gave a wide smile and slid down the ladder, and Rapunzel looked at me. And who's your friend? She gave me a smile, which I quickly reciprocated. The real Princess Rapunzel, standing right in front of me. How could my day get better? Varian put a hand on my shoulder. Oh, this is Piper. She's been a bit of a lab hand recently. She helped me make my invention. And wait until you see it. Everyone at the expo is going to be extremely impressed. He looked over his shoulder, then continued. Cass is gonna be there, right? He gave a nervous chuckle. Not that I'm doing this for Cassandra, but she's gonna be there, right? I laughed loudly and gave him a playful punch. You're such a nerd, I smiled. Rapunzel quickly retorted. From the sounds of it, so are you. She gave me a snarky smile. I laughed and looked at Varian. I'm gonna go bring this to the stage. Why don't you go see what everyone else is doing? Varian nodded and bounced off. Rapunzel gave me a curious glance. So, you and Varian have been hanging out. I nodded and she smiled. Do you like him? I immediately retracted, cringing at the words. No, gross. I'm 14. I don't need or want a boyfriend. I scoffed, adjusting the tarp of our invention. Rapunzel shrugged. Can't really argue with that. I had never even seen a man until I was 18. She looked at Eugene longingly as he picked his nose. The disgust grew on my face. I'm good, thanks. Rapunzel nodded. Well, if you ever need boy advice, just ask me. And if you ever need girl advice, ask Eugene. He's had a couple girlfriends. She smiled at Eugene, who looked a bit puzzled on why me, a girl, would ask for girl advice. But I gave her a polite smile and walked away. I waited backstage for Varian, and he ran up. What took so long? I snapped. Sorry, I was helping Cass do her duties, and I fell down the stairs. My arm hurts, and the floor was oddly slippery. Varian sighed. I was getting exhausted just hearing about it. He then followed it with, Anyway, Cass is gonna help me. You go explore the expo. He smiled widely. I frowned. Are you sure? I helped build it. Varian nodded. I'm sure. I put your name on the thingy anyway, so when your dad reads the list of contestants, he'll see your name. Where is your dad anyway? He looked at the crowd. I rolled my eyes. I told you, he's not here. He doesn't care. Varian frowned. Oh, man. My dad wanted to invite your dad to lunch. He sighed. Anyway, go. He pushed me off stage as Cassandra and the St. Croix walked past. I overheard their conversation. When Varian saw Cass, he said, "You ready? Because a certain alchemist could use his assistant." Cass sighed. "Listen, Varian, I'm really sorry, but things have changed. I can't help you anymore. I'm St. Croix's personal..." Suddenly, St. Croix snapped. "Hello, security detail. I moved my person in this direction." He sounded snooty and uptight. Why did I look up to this guy so much again? Oh yeah, he made cool things. But I can assure, Varian and I have made much cooler stuff. I didn't hear what Varian said next since I had entered and been pushed far into the crowd. I was suddenly unable to make my way to the front. I could barely see. People from all 7 kingdoms had come to see the expo. It was so hard to move. After a couple of inventions were presented, I was finally back to the front, but it was too late. Varian had settled for someone else. Great. "Behold, the power of alchemy!" The curtain shuffled and the crowd laughed. Varian looked so embarrassed. Eventually, a guy I recently learned his name to be Shorty emerged from the curtain, announcing, "Behold, the power of this guy!" Varian looked frustrated and Shorty nudged him. "Go, do the thing." Varian cleared his throat, clearly agitated. I let out a little giggle. It was kind of funny. Shorty had a look of realization as he said, "Oh, right." He pulled the curtain back to reveal our invention, and I clapped. Whispers of oohs and ahs came from the crowd. Varian smiled. "I give you the elemental remigrifier, named by Piper Wilson." Varian finally noticed me, and I gave him a sarcastic wave. He smiled and waved back, then looked to Shorty. "Ahem, assistant?" Shorty proceeded to dump sand into the remigrifier. Varian started the machine, and I smiled in anticipation. The machine was running so smoothly, all our hours of work finally paying off. He smiled at the crowd. "The rotation causes friction, which heats the sand, while the counter-centrifugal force promotes particle compression. The end result?" He stopped the remigrifier. 50 pounds of sand turns into this. He pulled out the small purple element we had put weeks into creating. "I call this new element Cassandrium." I snorted loudly at my friend's crushing, and he gave me a look. Cassandra gasped, and Shorty fell asleep, causing a chain reaction that ended in a knife launching at St. Croix. Cassandra caught it just before it hit him, and St. Croix scoffed. "Despite its lack of flair and panache, I was almost inclined to give your device a mediocre assessment." Varian sputtered. "Flair? What does flair have to do with..." I gave St. Croix an anger-filled look, failing to catch his attention. St. Croix interrupted Varian. "However, considering your assistant nearly lanced my nasal cavity, I've no choice but to disqualify you. Next!" From what I could understand, Cassandra tried to defend Varian, but St. Croix only snapped at her. The next presentation was Pizzazz Central, flashy and otherwise a dud, though we did get chocolate. It made a ball float, great crowd pleaser, but nothing new to science. But somehow it got first place. Varian and I stood at a fountain, frustrated as the crowd dispersed to see the rest of the event. Cassandra came down to talk to us. "You should have won," she stated. Varian frowned. "It doesn't matter. The truth is, all I really want to do is impress you. I thought if I showed you what I was capable of, you might see something in me, something special. It was just being dumb." I frowned at Varian and rubbed his back to comfort him. Cassandra rolled her eyes. "But you did impress me. Varian, you're a great kid. You're smart, you're compassionate, you're unique," she smiled. Varian smiled and I saw him blush a little. "Thanks for saying that." Cassandra looked back at the stage. "No, it looks like St. Croix liked your invention after all." She smiled. Varian and I turned around to see St. Croix messing with our machine. We both ran up to the stage as Varian shouted, "Master St. Croix, no, don't!" I walked up toward him and said, "You're building too much pressure." St. Croix pushed us away. "Back off, children. I am an esteemed scientist." Varian panicked. "Don't!" St. Croix activated the machine and sent it flying as it malfunctioned. "That's not ideal!" I shouted as the machine bounced around. St. Croix sputtered. "Somebody do something!" he shouted. Suddenly, the machine shot toward us, and Cassandra pushed Varian and I out of the way as the machine hit St. Croix. He suddenly shouted, "Double disqualified!" The remigrifier landed on the cocky show-off's machine, spinning midair. Varian smiled. "You chose me!" he laughed. Cassandra rolled her eyes. "Don't flatter yourself, kid. Now come on, we have a job to do." She ran up to the stage. Our machine was spinning so fast it was creating lightning. I stopped at the stairs, frozen in fear. I hadn't said goodbye to my dad before I left. Why didn't I do that? Varian shook his head. Oh no, this is bad, he said in fear. Cassandra looked at him. How bad? Varian looked at Cassandra, then to me. Introducing the counter-centrifugation to the magnetism could result in, well, that! We all looked toward the sky. A cyclone was forming from the two machines. I couldn't move. I'd never been frozen in fear before. I thought I was brave. Why couldn't I be brave now? Why didn't I say goodbye? I heard Cassandra and Varian talking, but I couldn't make out the words. Ringing in my ears was overwhelming. Before I knew it, the cyclone sucked me up, and I passed out. Half convinced I was dead, when I woke up in a white room, you can guess I was deeply shocked. She's awake! I heard a cheerful voice from beside me. I looked and I saw Varian. Taking a look around the room, I realized I was in the Royal Medic's office. I blinked a couple times. My head really hurt. What happened? Varian smiled as he excitedly told me the story. It was crazy! You got sucked into the storm. I had to jump on like a bunch of floating booths to pull you out. Then we used Rapunzel's Mega Dry to lift me up, and I stopped the machines. And look what Cass gave me. He showed off his #1 prized ribbon, and I gave him a smile. I suddenly remembered the thoughts I had before being sucked into the storm. Does my dad know I'm here? I must have looked panicked because Varian also looked kind of panicked. Varian shrugged. I don't know. My dad is outside, though. I'm pretty sure he told your dad you're here, but I don't think he's coming. I sighed. He probably figured I'm most likely alive. We should get back to Old Corona. I can bake you something as a thanks for saving my life and all that jazz. He gave me a wild smile, hugging me for a moment. Sounds great. I stood up and almost immediately tripped. Varian caught me and helped me up. I was still a bit dizzy, but we got home fine enough. On our way home, the princess and her lady-in-waiting came with us. I was unsure why until Varian snuck us off to show them the rocks that had inspired our machine. They told us those were the same rocks that had returned Rapunzel's hair. She then promised to help us figure everything out, despite her father being in denial. End Chapter 2.